Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the webinar tonight with myself and Kyle Claussen, the CEO of Resolve. I'm going to give it a couple minutes and let some more people log on. We did start a little bit early, but I'm going to still give it some time. In the meantime, before I hand it over to Kyle, I just want to introduce myself. My name is Peyton Jennings, and I am the Physician Engagement Coordinator here at Practice Match. So if you're attending from the webinars or any of the emails reminding you, that is me. I do a lot of the career fair related topics and also all of the webinars that we host. We try to host a webinar at least quarterly. Sometimes we try to host it at least monthly. So Kyle, this isn't his first webinar with us and hopefully not his last. So if you guys like this, be sure to check out our website and there will be more. And also all of our old ones from him speaking on topics are recorded on there as well. So Kyle, you can go ahead and take it away. And again, if anyone has any questions tonight, just go ahead and put it in the chat or Q&A box and we'll both be monitoring that to answer those.
Sounds great. Thanks for the introduction. Yeah, we've done a few of these now, Peyton, and it's a topic that we think is really important. It really ties into what you guys are doing at the career fair. And so we want to talk about physician compensation, physician contracts, things that you should be thinking about, and hopefully answering questions from you guys. That's really why we're here. So I'm gonna go through a few slides for you, give you some things to think about, but please do use the Q&A and the chat feature as we go along on this. So as a starting point, and I'm gonna just shut my video off till we're done here, but as a starting point, I think it's really important for you guys to think about and to understand the dynamics around the market for your services and to know that, in almost every specialty, there's been a shortage and there continues to be a shortage. There's a lot of consolidation. There's very few private practices now as far as percentage of the whole. And so you need to understand who you're negotiating with. You need to understand what your priorities are. And you need to know that supply and demand is in your favor as you work through this process. And so when you're out in the market, right, when you're at the career fair and you're looking at different positions, hospital employed positions are certainly the norm. You're going to see academic jobs. You're going to see, maybe groups that are owned by private equity. I'm going to call all of those things similar, right, to this hospital category where you don't have much control, mostly because you're not going to be an owner, right, of that practice. There's no ability to generate ancillary revenue in those settings, but they generally come with higher guarantees, maybe benefit packages that are more flushed out than other offers that you'd see. And you're going to correspondingly, maybe see some private practice offerings that are out there where you do have some of that autonomy, some of that upside, and potentially some ancillaries there. But generally, lower guarantees, maybe benefit packages that aren't as fully flushed out and fully detailed. And so your goal is certainly you don't want to end up with a contract in the bottom left. You want to try to push that as high to the top and to the right as you can. And so your strategy for going about that is first off, make sure you know what your priorities are before you get into a negotiation. Make sure you've identified where you want to be, what you're going to prioritize, whether that's compensation or scope, of practice, what you want to do. And when I say scope of practice, it's not specialty, right? It's more of, do I want to take call? Do I not? Do I want to work inpatient or outpatient? Are there certain, types of things I want to see or not want to see? And then finally, time, right? Do you need time for things like administrative work, teaching, all of that, right? That's personal to you. Every client that comes to us is very different on those things. But once you understand what you're looking for, then you can go about taking a look at the contract and say, okay, based on my priorities, what are the risks in the contract for me? We're going to talk through that, give you some ideas on terms to spot. We're going to talk about knowing what market data looks like, where you can find some of that information. And then finally, going about making the ask for those changes, what negotiations can look like, what some common, maybe misunderstandings are, misconceptions are on that. And so that's kind of our outline for the next 15 or 20 minutes as we go through this, okay? So step number one is contract risk, right? How do I know if the contract is good or bad, or if it fits my situation or not? All right. And I want you to think about this in three categories of topics. And so your first category or your first thing that you should be spotting for issues would be anything that hits on your duties and responsibilities. So scheduling, right? Locations of practice, how many days of the week am I going to work? How much call am I going to take? As a starting point, The language on the right is probably how your contract is going to read, or something very similar to that, where it says you're going to perform the services and have the duties and obligations as we determine from time to time. So we can change that. We might require you to assist at various locations, right? And you're going to participate in a call rotation that fits our call policy. So if that's the language in your contract or something very similar to that, um, it's not beneficial for you, right? I mean, there's no definition around any of that. And so we would certainly encourage you to craft language or to get some, boundaries around what that's going to look like. Other things that would tie into this category of duties and responsibilities would be outside activities or side gigs. A lot of our clients now have an interest in doing those things. They may have intellectual property interests, patents, copyrights, devices that they're working on, things that they need to protect. The default language, again, is going to say that you probably can't do those things, and that anything that you create is going to be property or at least partial property of the employer. Not good for you if those things are important. And then finally, the last thing in this category would be, whether or not you want to supervise APPs. We'll talk about, if you should be compensated for that or not, and if your contract details that as well. And then finally, that time allocation piece, if you need time for admin, research, teaching, etc. All of those things are kind of category number one for me. These are the factors that generally lead to dissatisfaction, right? Burnout, whatever you want to call it. First, broken promises, because it seems to be common where, you came in and maybe at that point in time, call was 1 in 6, and then all of a sudden 2 people leave and now call's 1 in 4. If your contract doesn't protect you on that or on limiting call, obviously that's a very different lifestyle. And depending on your specialty, some specialties have heavier call than others. It's the reason why these things are so important and why we feel like it's good for both you and for the employer to define those things, because retention is important, right? Recruiting's hard. We know that. Retention is obviously very important as well. So suggestion number one for me is to make sure you get this category of information correct. Okay. The second area is one of the things we want to talk about today is compensation. How do I get paid? What models do I look at? How do I find data on this? Most of your compensation packages are going to have some, if not all, of these items included. Some of these things are going to be in more, high demand areas, rural settings, right? Hard to recruit areas. But the first 3 or 4 we see in almost every contract. So you're likely going to run into a base salary that's going to have some type of production bonus or incentive bonus tied to it. That's going to be based on either work RVUs or collections, maybe gross charges. We'll talk about that on the next slide on how to evaluate those things. And then most offers also have some type of signing bonus or relocation allowance or both with them. And these things are important to pay attention to, not only from, a recruitment standpoint and an incentive to get you to sign standpoint, but also it's going to tie into our next category, which is termination issues and, being careful on if you take a signing bonus, do you have to repay it or not if the contract ends, things like that. Okay. Some things that are a little less common. Quality components or quality bonuses, we see that increasing. There's a lot of talk and, I think potential movement towards quality being a component, but we see it still as being, kind of less than 10% of a total compensation package if it's included at all. Student loan forgiveness can be there, retention bonuses can be there, and even stipends while you finish training, right, where they're paying you while you finish, can be in the contract as an incentive to get you to sign early. Okay. Other things that are going to fall into more of a benefits category, things you want to pay attention to. Some are modifiable, some are not. Things like CME, vacation time, other benefits like health insurance, retirement plans. Those are categories. Anything that's a group benefit, you're not going to be able to negotiate and change, but it is really, really important that you understand those items, that you're comparing, hopefully apples to apples when you're looking at offers side by side. And so valuing that as part of the total compensation package is definitely important. Okay. So let's talk about how you would evaluate compensation and understanding what production can look like and how they're going to quantify that and how they're going to value that. Okay. So if you're on a work RVU model, as an example, the analysis or what you should be thinking about is if I'm paid at a certain level, I would expect my production requirements to also be tied to a similar level, right? And I also want my multiplier or the conversion factor, right? The dollar per work RVU that I'm being paid to be fair. So in column one, if you receive a contract offer, the base salary is 200,000. It's got a production threshold or work RVU requirement of 3,000 before you bonus. The way that I would encourage you to analyze that is to say, okay, what's the median compensation for my specialty? If that also happens to be 200, right? We've checked that box, so no issue there. If the median work RVU production, however, is 2,500 and your threshold is 3,000, you should be raising your eyebrows and asking why, right? Why is there a discrepancy there? If each work RVU is worth $40 and there's 500, right, that you're being asked to produce without any payment, that's a $20,000 deficit from what market says is fair market value for your services. And so you can see that same type of analysis where you're comparing, medians to medians in different categories or 60th percentiles to 60th percentiles, whatever the case is. You can do that with a collection model. You can do that with a billings model. But what you want to make sure of is if you're producing at median or if you're producing at 75th percentile, you're also taking home, approximately those numbers, right? You don't want to have a huge gap there. Okay. So hopefully that component makes sense. Certainly can ask questions on that and we can come back to it, at the end of this as well. Okay, so your last category would be anything that touches on termination. And we already talked about signing bonuses a little bit, that there may be repayment obligations with those. It would be similar for student loan forgiveness. It'd be similar for stipends that you might see in residency. You're likely going to have to pay those back if you don't stay a certain amount of time. The larger the dollar amount gets, usually the longer the repayment period. So if it's $10,000 or $20,000, it might be 1 year. If it's 50,000, it might be 3 or 4. Okay. And so the larger those numbers get, the longer commitment that they're going to be asking for as part of that. You need to know how the contract can terminate. So if you change your mind, if life happens, right, a year and a half in, you need to move on, or vice versa. If the employer is going to let you go for no reason, you need to understand how much notice they have to give you. Okay. So that's called termination without cause. It should be in your contract. You need to make sure you're identifying that issue. You need to pay attention to other monetary things like malpractice insurance and tail coverage. Tail for certain specialties can be a 6-figure number, right? So for specialties like OB, where if a mistake happens, kids have a long time to bring a lawsuit. And so anytime you're covering a longer time frame, right, and with damages that are potentially high, your insurance payment is going to be high on that as well. So knowing who pays for that, whether it's you, whether it's the employer, or whether there's some type of meet in the middle policy where you're paying for part of it and they're paying for part of it, all of that should be detailed in your contract. Okay. And then finally, the one of the hot topics right now across the country is non-competes. Some states have banned non-competes for physicians. Some have limited it, put restrictions on it as far as timing or geography or compensation that has to go along with it. Most of them meaning most states, still allow non-competes as long as they're reasonable in time and scope. And so we're going to walk through an example of what that can look like on the next slide. But we get the question a lot on what is the FTC going to do with this? Aren't they going to ban them anyway? They're not applicable. All of the, groups that I'm in on social media tell me that they're not enforceable. I think that's really a mistake to go into a contract and just expect, right? Either one, the employer not to enforce the terms, or two, the FTC to bail you out. I would try to correct it up front, right? And try to get it taken out if you need to, or correct the mileage or scope, to a level that you're comfortable with. Because we just don't know what's going to happen right down the road. Okay. Other things to be careful on, or just to pay attention to, if there is any production bonus that's being paid, you'd like to know, if the contract terminates, when is that going to be paid out? Do I get partial credit? Is it only paid on the quarter, right? Am I forfeiting, a month of that or not? What a force majeure clause is, if it's in your contract, this is basically a kind of a COVID protection. We didn't see force majeure clauses at all prior to COVID. What it means is that there's an act of God, like a pandemic, that the contract doesn't have to be followed and they can breach that without penalty. So you want to be really, really careful on force majeure language as well. Okay. So if you can kind of hit on those big items, right? That'll take out a lot of the risk for you. Maybe not all the risk, but a lot of it revolving around termination. But the big one that we talked about was non-competes. What these look like, and the reason there's 3 or 4 circles on this diagram here is because with the expansion and the movement towards employment and health systems being out there, a lot of the non-competes that we see right now are being drafted where it not only applies from where you practice, but it applies to all system locations. And so if there's let's say a 3-mile non-compete, right, where you can't go to work within 3 miles of any location of the health system, what you may view as a 3-mile non-compete turns into 10, 15, 20 miles pretty quickly. Okay. And so getting some exclusions to your primary practice location or getting exclusions for how the contract terminates, or maybe having a carve out for academics, right? Or the VA or, something, for you, if that's important to you, is certainly something we would recommend. At minimum, you really need to understand these things to know what you're getting into, because they do reduce leverage down the road for negotiations and renegotiations. And there's actually some data on that we'll touch on as far as the value point of how much these things are worth. Okay. So the next step, and maybe your first step actually in the entire process is you need to know what's fair, right? You need to know what market says your specialty is worth at this time for this location, right? So where do you go about finding that information? Again, there's 3 categories that I have you think about. The first one is what I'm going to call survey data. There's a handful of surveys that are out there. If you're not familiar with these, you likely will be. Your contract may reference them, and that's what the language in the bottom left is. You may see compensation caps or kind of these, stark compliance paragraphs where it says that notwithstanding anything in the contract, we're not going to pay you past the 90th percentile of a certain survey like MGMA, because we want to make sure that we're, not intentionally violating Stark. Okay. So if they're referencing it in your contract, that should be a tell for you that they think that that's a good source for fair market value, and you should know what that looks like. Okay, so the likely surveys you'll see or hear of: MGMA, AMGA, Sullivan and Cotter, some others that blend rates, right? There's also surveys by Merritt Hawkins and Doximity and some others that are out there. Those are generally not accepted or generally not utilized, I guess I should say, for compliance purposes. And so that's why we think having access to some of these major surveys is really important as a step one. Step 2 would be getting access to as many offers as you can get, right? And so I'm going to actually jump to the third category here of other offers. This is your best data point. So if you can, attend a career fair like the one that you're at, get 3 or 4 offers, you're going to know, roughly what it looks like for your services in the area that you're interested in. You're going to know what retirement plans are being offered. You're going to know what call compensation looks like. Okay. And so you're not going to have to guess at that. That's also live information, right? It's not a year old, right? It's not, blended with others. It's for you specifically. So that's your best data point. Survey data is going to be helpful from a compliance standpoint. What I'd also encourage you to do, and a third source for you, if you don't have a lot of offers, or if you just want to see a larger pool, right, of live offers that are out there, you can go to resolve.com, right? That's our site. We provide a lot of this salary information for free. You can log in, create an account, and see what your peers are earning, what they've negotiated, right? What some of those terms are. It's really helpful. It's verified, right? So the one thing that you don't get with the survey data or with some of these others is you don't know if they're real, right? Data entries or not. And so more data is always better. So we would encourage you to have as much access to this stuff as you can get. Get access to some of the surveys, verified contracts, and also other offers that hopefully you have in hand. Okay. So the reason it's so important to have access to all 3 is I'm just going to show you for one specialty, kind of variances that we'll see in fair market value. When we look at contracts in our system, there are anywhere from lows of 128 in this specialty, 1,000 a year, up to 405 guaranteed for this specialty as compensation each year, with a median at 289. Okay, and this would be a starting offer, right? This is a new position for somebody either coming out of training or transitioning. If you look at some of the survey information on that exact same specialty, their median is about 248 and ours is 289. And so you can see that there's a pretty big jump there, right? So there's no perfect definition of fair market value. You can also see that total compensation, meaning even once you're out in year 2 and beyond, and you have a full panel of patients and you're busy, is 321. And there are some places that are offering more than that in your very first year just to get you to come and sign up. So having access to all of that, we think is extremely important because there's a lot of value there, for you that you're potentially leaving on the table. Okay. So you've spotted the issues, you know what fair market value is. So now the question is how do you go about asking for that? How should you negotiate that? My suggestion for you is to think about it this way. Okay. You need to think about having multiple offers for one reason, and that's to know what your alternatives are, right? When you get to this step. So it's nice to have comps. It's nice to know what's out there. But more importantly, you've got to have an option B, right? Because if you want to negotiate 3 or 4 terms and the employer, maybe they have 5 candidates and they just don't feel like they need to move on those items, you need to know if you have another alternative that you like or not, right? So that's the concept of BATNA in negotiation is what can I do if this doesn't work out? You also need to ask for things in good faith. So we find that employers and any party to a negotiation is much more receptive if you're asking for things that make sense, right? You're not asking for things that are completely outside of industry norms, or you're not nitpicking every single paragraph as you go through the contract. There are going to be some items that are more important to you than others. There may be some that you would like to change, or you think should be changed, but if it's not as important on your list, you may want to think about leaving that off or at least dropping it in the first round of back and forth. And so we think it's not just deal breakers. We think it's somewhere in between as a general rule. Getting things that have a lot of risk in them and or things that are really important to you addressed early on and communicate it all at once. Nobody likes to have piecemeal negotiation where you're going back and forth for information constantly. And so we would encourage you to get all that information and all your requests together in the initial conversation. You do need to be prepared for the response and maybe even before you get the contract that you're going to hear that this is our standard contract. Every single physician in our entire facility has it, right? We never make changes to it. It doesn't matter if it's an employer solo private practice that has 1 or 2 right physicians, or if it's a large health system, they all say that. From where we sit, most contracts are changed. As an example of what that looks like in a response, non-competes, which they generally will tell you that they never change. You'll see responses like this where we've had the contract vetted, we know it's good, everybody signed it, and then that said, we are providing a change, right? Because we were told it was important and it was a deal breaker for this physician to sign. So sometimes you're not going to know until you ask, and you're going to have to respond to that standard contract discussion, throughout that process. The other thing that I would tell you is you may not get good faith, at least from a data standpoint, discovery back from the other side. If they're utilizing surveys that you can't get your hands on, right? Let's say it's Sullivan and Cotter, who doesn't provide information to physicians, just systems. It's likely that they're not going to share that information with you, so don't expect that back. And it's why it's really important for you to go out and get access to your own information as well. Okay. So how much movement is there, and is it worth it for you to go through this process? If you can have a 10% increase on physician comp every year, over your career, that's going to be worth about $2.5 million. So my suggestion to you is, yes, it's absolutely worth it. Not only is 30,000 a year, right, worth it, but it's over 30 years, a really, really big number. Okay. And it's not just base compensation or signing bonuses that I have you think about and have the value, right, sitting with you on this. Non-competes are a major problem for renegotiation. And in the FTC's discussion on this, they've come out with statistic that says in certain markets, there could be a 37% reduction, right, in compensation right now for physicians because of the lack of, competition or the ability for physicians to move around. And so that number is obviously much larger. It's about 9.3 million in career earnings. And so I just think, if it's important to you, you absolutely have to push. Even if it's not important to you today, it might be important to you 2 or 3 years from now, right? When you want to renegotiate or move around. And so addressing comp as well as your non-compete is certainly important. Okay. So what we do, just so everybody's clear, we have a platform. If you go to resolve.com, you can find access to free tools on this stuff. You can get access to data. There's paid components as well if you want some of that survey data that we talked about. If you want to connect with an attorney to help review a document or help you negotiate, all of that is there for you on a hopefully easy to use and friendly site. And so with that, I will answer any and all questions. for you is for the next about 25 minutes.
Yes, I also just put in the chat box for any of you that are new, that joined later. If you guys have any questions, feel free to put those in the chat and Q&A for Kyle to answer. One just came through. Can you see that on your end, Kyle?
Yep, I've got it. Okay, so what can be negotiated in academic contracts? I hate to use the answer of anything because there's certain things that are going to be non-negotiable with every employer. But we see things like compensation. We see things like time allocations, whether it's your time that you need for research or teaching, work schedules, days of the week, signing bonuses. I mean, there's a lot, I guess, is the answer that you can adjust. There may be certain things like faculty handbooks or plans that they have to keep in place for everybody. So you want to be careful on that. But I wouldn't treat an academic contract differently from a starting point than you should, anything else. Okay, there's a few more coming in here. What's the difference between tail and occurrence-based insurance? Great question. So I'm going to go back to the slide on termination while we talk about this, because this is one of the issues you should be spotting. So tail coverage was listed out here. So at a very high level, there's two main types of insurance that you can have while you're working. The first is a claims-made policy. A claims-made policy covers you for claims, right, that come in. So if a patient sues you while you're working with employer A, you've got coverage, right? So there's no need for any additional insurance at that point in time. The other type of policy is what's called an occurrence-based policy. That covers you for the act of seeing the patient. It has nothing to do with when the patient sues you, okay? So if you're with employer A, you've got an occurrence-based policy, you make a mistake, you commit malpractice, the patient sues you 5 years later when you're working for employer B, because their insurance covered that act, you have coverage, you don't need tail, right? It's like prepaid tail, so to speak. If it's a claims-made policy and you're now with employer B, the claim comes in, that policy doesn't cover it, right? Because the claim came in after you've left. And so that's why you need tail in that situation. It's not a question of if you need tail, it's just a matter of who pays for it, right? So claims-made policy needs tail, occurrence does not. Make sure you check your contract for that language to know which one is applicable. Okay. Next question. Have you seen paid time off being negotiated? What's the max you can ask for? Is maternity leave part of a negotiation? So yes, so paid time off varies by specialty and employer type. So if you're joining a private practice on a partnership track, usually your vacation time or paid time off time is lower, right? Pre-partnership than it is once you're a partner. And then specialties vary. So that, if you're looking for a number generally across all specialties, 4 or 5 weeks is probably what you're going to see, but it really can vary. As far as maternity leave, yes. So we do have clients that'll negotiate in specific things on maternity leave. Maybe they need part of that paid. Maybe they need FMLA protections because they're going to be pregnant in the first year when FMLA wouldn't generally apply. So certainly if that's an issue for you, you can work on having that addressed. What percentage higher salary than what's being offered is typically a good start to negotiations? Yeah, I think that really depends on where they started, right? So you don't get to pick the starting point. So if we go back to the slide on comp and market data and just look at this example, if they come in with an opening offer at 128 and the median is 289, well, that's a pretty big percentage jump that you're going to be asking for, right? You're asking them to double it. Versus if they come in at 270 and you want it to 289, that's pretty small. So there's going to be a certain level that might start to look unrealistic, right? And you may have to know why they're at 128. There might be a really great production model that goes along with it. And so maybe you want to leave that low salary alone. So I don't think it's just a one piece that you can push on, but I don't think there's also a percentage that's the right number, because I think it depends right on where they started. Okay, when responding to the employer's initial offer and asking for a higher base salary, ask for a higher number to meet a goal in the middle. Yeah, so I think this is a question on just how to negotiate. Should you ask for something higher, right? If you want to end at 289, do I ask for 300, right? Knowing that they're going to come back. I think it's always, you know, possible and really probable, right, that they're probably going to counter again. But I don't think you should horse trade, right, where you're just trying to end up in the middle. I think it's more about backing up the ask and knowing why you're asking for it. I mean, we have clients that ask for very small increases, right, and then they just stick to it. It's just this is the number I need. I need an extra whatever it is, 20,000, and I'm not going to take 10, right? It's got to be 20. We also have some that if the offer is so far apart, right, the delta is so big, I mean, you know that there's going to be some back and forth on that. So I would tell you to come in with good data behind what you're doing rather than just picking a number and trying to meet in the middle. Um, do you know what your partners or what, people in the same specialty are going to make in the same employer? You won't. So, I mean, they may tell you that there's equity, right, between everyone. We know, I mean, from where we sit, because we often see, you know, someone come in, right, an employer, and then a year later somebody else comes in, or 6 months later somebody comes in, and you can see signing bonuses change, you can see compensation rates change, you can see when people negotiate, when they don't, right, what happens. So I think there are some employers that absolutely do, right, and maybe they're honest on that, and there really is no wiggle room. Most of them, though, are going to react to the market, right? If your specialty is in demand at that moment, they're going to make concessions for you. Okay. If an organization informs you that they're capped at the 75th percentile for comp, as they're not for profit, they're worried about, yep, Medicare triggers. How much truth is that? Well, I think there's certainly truth to being concerned when you get past the 75th percentile, but I think it depends on what you're doing, right? There's not a rule that says you can't make more than that. Otherwise, you'd have a whole pool of people, right, from the 75th to the 100th percentile that are non-compliant. It has to do with what work you're doing underneath of it. So if you're performing at the 90th percentile, there's no reason you can't make the 90th percentile. Now it may trigger, they may want to document what you're doing, right? And have kind of that audit, component to it. But generally speaking, if you're busy, you're producing at a higher level. I mean, I'd certainly be asking for that compensation to be paid. Can we use Resolve as a resource to look up RVU medians? You can, yeah. So I mean, in the data that is on our site, and some of this, the RVU components, and depending on how many filters you want, you're going to have to end up paying for that. But there are RVU data points in there, right? So you'll know what median is for your specialty in that area. You can see what others are being offered. So the answer to that is yes. Is the initial guaranteed salary always supposed to be lower than median income based on productivity of that particular practice? Always supposed to be lower than, no, I mean, no. So we have initial offers, right? So like this slide again is a good example. We have offers come in, right, that are higher than total median comp for people that are 2 years out. So it really depends on what's going on. But I mean, certainly not an uncommon position for someone to take, to say, hey, in the first year, right, you're probably not going to be as productive as somebody who's been here for 2 or 3 years. And so maybe we want to have your base salary, set lower. I think that's a fair argument if they have a lot of candidates, right? They feel like they can fill it. But then two, you also want to make sure your production threshold is set to that same level. So if they're paying 40th percentile in that case, your threshold to bonus should also be 40th percentile. Otherwise, once you go past that number, I mean, you're taking a huge discount. How can you negotiate 1099 salary versus W-2? So a 1099, just for those of you that aren't aware, means you're an independent contractor. It means the employer is not paying for certain things like benefits. Usually they're not paying for, your half of the employment tax that's out there. So for you to be in an apples to apples, kind of fair situation on that, the 1099 position should be paying more. I mean, at least 8 or 9% more, if not, what the benefits are worth on top of that. So you can still utilize data from W-2s, but you just have to do that calculation on top to make sure you get to the right level. All really good questions. Anything else I can try to answer for you guys? Also, I know that there's sometimes questions you don't want to ask in a group setting, and so my email is in the slide. So feel free to shoot that over as well if you've got things that you want to ask more anonymously. Any comments on telemedicine contracts? Yeah, I mean, certainly you're running into more and more of that, right? I would just tell you to be careful, especially if there's a non-compete in telemedicine, what that looks like. We're seeing a lot of those that are really, really broad, that are almost trying to prevent you from doing any other telemedicine, which we think is, likely unenforceable. But I'd be really careful on the non-compete, which actually takes us to our next chat question of how negotiable are non-competes. It depends on organization. We see movement on geographic location, right, of where they're applying it from. We see changes on how big that geography is. We see changes on timing. So if it's set for 2 years, you can push it to 1 year, maybe or less. We also see exceptions being built in. So they definitely are negotiable. It just depends, again, on how much leverage you have. If you don't need loan forgiveness, is that uncommon? I would say probably yes. I mean, I think the data would say that most people coming out have student loans. And can you use that for negotiating and ask for resources somewhere else? If they're offering student loan forgiveness as a starting point, and you don't have them, I mean, it's the same budget item, right, for the employer. They could make that a signing bonus, or they could make it a retention payment every year. Certainly you should be trying to extract that value, right? If they're offering it to a different candidate just because they have loans, I'd want to try to capitalize on that too. Now, if it's a state program or a program that they don't control necessarily through a different entity, that may be different. You might have a harder time, with that. Is the job market influenced by seasonality? Man, Peyton, this is maybe in your wheelhouse. I think there's always a need for physicians. I mean, I think there's more physicians coming out, right? Obviously at the end of June every year, but from where we sit, most physicians are getting contracts, kind of September to April. They're not doing it last minute in June.
Yeah, I agree with that.
Yeah, okay. So maybe is the answer to your question. Contracts that say after 2 years, salary is determined by prevailing compensation program then in effect. Yeah. I mean, it could be good, right? I mean, if they're going to go and pull surveys and the data's gone up for you, I mean, it might turn out okay. I also think you probably need to get comfortable with the idea that you're going to be renegotiating your contract every 2 or 3 years. It's not something that you do once and it's set forever. And so, if that's in the contract, do I love it there? Probably not. I mean, we'd like more definition around it, but we also know that even if that's not there, right, and the data changes drastically in those 2 years or 3 years, if it's in your favor, you should be raising your hand and asking to renegotiate. And if it goes down, you can bet that they're going to come to you with an amendment saying, hey, rates changed. So I think that's just the reality of the world that we're in now, right? In an employed world, nothing is your contract's not going to be set forever. It's probably on a 2-year cycle. Which one is better, locum or a contracted job after graduation? That is very personal to you and your preferences. So I'm not going to weigh in on that one. I think it just depends on what you want to do.
Kyle, there's also one in the Q&A as well. I don't know if you can see that one.
Let me hop into that. Can we expand more on RVUs? Yeah. So let's go back to the compensation slide and just talk a little bit about how those are calculated. So in this comp model, right, this example is on a work RVU system. So for those of you that are unfamiliar with work RVUs, CMS sets values, right? So every patient encounter that you have has a certain work RVU value attached to it. And so what a lot of contracts do is they'll say, okay, let's tally those up over the course of a year or maybe a quarter, right? A certain time period. And if you've crossed the threshold that we've established, in my example here, it's 3,000, then you're going to get a bonus. And for every work RVU beyond that 3,000 level, we're going to pay you $40, right? And we'll tally that up once a year. So Understanding RVUs is really important, but also understanding what's normal for your specialty is important, and potentially even how much volume is there, for you. If you're the first hire that they've made in a long time, or you're the first one in your specialty, it's why a guarantee would be important to me, because you just don't know if there's 1,000 RVUs for you to see, or if there's 5,000, right? If there's a lot of historical data and you know what previous hires have generated, you have a pretty good idea of where your compensation should fall. So it's just a metric, right, to look at production that's not tied to collections. So it has more to do with what you're doing than what the payer mix is. Good question. What typically triggers renegotiation? Does it happen during the anniversary? Can you bring it up anytime? So usually what triggers it is something's not going well, right? So sometimes it's built in, automatically, where at the end of 2 years you're going to have this discussion, but most of the time not. So it's usually that that the market's changed for payment, or something's not going well. You don't want to take call, you don't want to supervise, an APP anymore. You need a day different in your schedule. That's generally why it happens, and then from there, you're probably going to have to be the one to bring these things up, right? I mean, most of the time, employers are pretty content with the contract that they have, right? Because reimbursements either go up or your compensation goes up, and they'd rather keep you at that historical rate for longer, if they can. So most of the time, you can do it anytime. I mean, unless your contract is locked for 2 years, but that's pretty uncommon. So the general rule is whenever you need to. Okay, anybody else? Okay.
I was gonna say, if there's no more questions, we can go ahead and wrap this up. If you guys want to, feel free to write down, take a picture of Kyle's information, you can, but I will also be sending out an email to all the attendees tonight with that information on there, just in case that you guys missed it, as well as my information and anything related to the webinars and career fairs. This will also be posted by the end of the week to our website, so you guys will have access to this, and you can go over you can't go over it again, but it'll obviously be recorded for you guys to watch. So it will be like he's going over it again with you guys. So if you guys don't have any other questions, I think one actually just popped up for you.
Let me open that back up. Hold on. Difference in leverage for salary negotiation for physicians needing a visa waiver versus those that don't. If you're needing a waiver, right? You're on a J visa. I don't think that it means you have less leverage, but there are some costs that are going to go along with, right, the position. There's some immigration fees and things like that. So you may see reduced signing bonuses or something else. But I think there's still plenty of those positions out there, right? And so leverage is really determined by how bad they need you, which we know usually they do, right? These are usually underserved areas. And two, what type of options you've got. So it's going to be a little more work for you. You should start earlier, right, in the process. There's a lot of these J waivers, state applications are due in October, right, and early on. So you're going to have to do your homework as early as possible. But I still think you have leverage. I still think you can negotiate. One more. Are there some aspects of the non-compete that are less important to negotiate since the FTC is involved in new guidelines? Until the FTC comes out with a rule and it's effective, the answer is no. I have a fairly high level of skepticism that the FTC is going to wipe that out for everybody, especially for physicians. So until that's in place, I would say no, make sure you negotiate the terms that you need. How soon or late can you negotiate a contract? Is there a timeline? I assume that means once you're under contract, right? Like when you can renegotiate. So I mean, I would say if you just signed the contract, right? I mean, probably not day one, right? You go in and renegotiate it. Probably not day two, but if you've been there 6 to 12 months and you know the data has changed, right? I mean, I think that that's probably fine. If you're talking about finishing training, right, and when you should be doing that, I would encourage you to start that process 12 months out. I mean, I think giving yourself more time is important. I think if you put yourself in a situation where you're up against the wall, I think it reduces the leverage you have. And so try to interview at as many spots as you can, within a short time frame. So you have 2 or 3 offers at the same time. That I think is best practice for you. Okay.
If there's no more questions, again, this will all be recorded and posted to our website by the end of this week. And I will also be sending out an email with Kyle's information on it as well for you guys. So,
Yeah,
all right, well,
appreciate you having us on and appreciate the questions. Thanks, guys.
thank you.
See ya.
Bye.
Bye.